everybody. Good morning, afternoon, and night. I want to welcome everyone to our workshop today using observations and evaluation with measurement and evaluation alum Tiffany Smith. My name is Yasmin Shimshek, and I am one of the moderators today, along with current student in our program, Doug Grindle. At American University, we are committed to pursuing inclusive excellence. One of our practices, shared from our Indigenous and Native communities, is to offer a lay in the acknowledgement at the beginning of our meetings and events. The goal is to build our mindfulness of the historical processes in which we still participate. American University is founded on the unceded land of the Nacotchtank, Anacostan, and Piscataway peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging these communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. American University also acknowledges that it was founded upon exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples, including those on whose land this institution is located. With this acknowledgement, we commit to working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Those of you who attend our events know that we always provide a land acknowledgement. I encourage you today to take this a step further and do some research on the land where you are sitting. If you're not aware of the history of the land, you can click the link in the chat to research it or send a text to the number in the chat as well. Take it away, Doug.
And before we get started today, I'd like to hear where you're all joining us from. If you'd like, perhaps write in the chat box where you're joining from, and I'll read it out. And because we have a lot of people here already joining us, so that's terrific. Also, our speaker today is Tiffany Smith, who's an alumna of the Measurement and Evaluation Program. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll have some time for questions at the end of the presentation today. It would be terrific if you can simply hold your questions or wait for them to be addressed at the end, but we'll please do as we go through, put them in the chat. So thank you very much. And we will monitor that chat for the questions as we go along. And back to you, Yasmin.
I'm seeing some messages come in. It looks like they're direct messages to me. Can everybody see the chat functions and responses? Just confirming.
I can see it, yes, but yeah, I saw your chat in there, but I don't see anyone else's.
Oh, it looks like it's not possible to message everyone. Um, we're gonna see what we can do about that. But as we get started, we're gonna go ahead and let Tiffany begin.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. And thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I know Bev is going to share the screen. Thank you so much. So, welcome everyone to today's webinar. Some of you might be familiar with observation and participant observation, so this might be a refresher for you all. But some of you, these topics might be relatively new. Regardless of where you're at, I'm just hoping that we have a good time together. We learned something together today. So looking at this title slide here, as you all know, today I'm going to be talking about observation and participant observation. And I want you all to get to know me a little bit. So if we go to the next slide here, I want to tell you just a little bit more about myself. There I am. So, and you all, mind you, I am working with my monitor right now, and you all are on my big monitor. So if you see me looking like this, I'm trying to see you. So never mind my eye shifting here. But once again, my name is Tiffany Smith. I use she, her pronouns, and I actually go by Tiff for short. So if you all ask any questions today, and if you want to be personable, feel free to just call me Tiff. I have used both qualitative and quantitative methods in evaluation of various public health programs, both at the federal level and at the state level out here in California for about 8 years now. And specifically where I'm from in California, I am from the San Francisco Bay Area. I don't live too far from Oakland, and I am currently, a resident of the land of the Ohlone tribe out here in the Bay Area. When I first started the program for my Master's of Science in Measurement and Evaluation, I was actually in Zambia. I served in the United States Peace Corps in Zambia from 2015 to 2017. And when I started the program, I was actually working for the United States Agency for International Development in Zambia. I was a monitoring and evaluation site visit coordinator from 2017 to 2018. And then after that, I decided to, come back to the States. I wanted to work in, public health programs here and, racial disparities within public health and gender disparities within public health and try to make that social impact and make that change here domestically in the States. So I finished the program, as you can see, I finished the Masters of Science in Measurement and Evaluation from American University. I finished that in 2019. And before that, I had done my bachelor's degree from a University of California, Los Angeles. That's UCLA for short. For some of my international folks who are here, welcome to the webinar. Happy to have you from so far. I actually was a project director at a group called Care Consulting Group from 2022 to 2024. Simultaneously, I was an evaluation and health equity advisor for an organization called Cities and People Advisors. I started that in the beginning of January, and I'm still there now as a little side gig where I do evaluation work for various higher education and health programs. I recently transitioned out of my job at Care Consulting Group, and now I am a full-time independent evaluator and a consultant since very recently, but I've been doing side work in evaluation in addition to my full-time job for a while. So that is a little bit more about me, but I'm going to dive into on the next slide here some learning objectives for today. And if you can go back to slide 3 for me, Bev, I'm going to talk about these learning objectives. Thank you. So today, what we hope to do is to, be able to tell the difference between observation and participant observation, right? How are they distinct from one another? um, to appreciate the use of observation and participant observation for monitoring and evaluation, discuss examples of observation and participant observation and what that looks like. I want to be as concrete as possible in today's webinar. And lastly, really understand how to record data from observation and participant observation. And before I get started on this next slide, it looks like the chat function is now working. I wanted to just get a sense from the group here who is here today. When you hear the words observation and participant observation as it pertains to evaluation, what, like, is that something that's familiar with you all? And you can just put something in the chat like, yes, I'm familiar, but still want to learn more, or no, I've never heard of it, or, I'm very familiar and I just want a refresher. I just want to get a sense of where we're at in the room today. So if you feel brave enough, you can put in the chat when you hear participant observation and evaluation. Is that familiar to you? And I'm going to give maybe about 10 more seconds here to see if anyone puts anything in the chat. If not, we'll just continue on. Oh, I see something. And thank you for putting that in the chat. We will talk about that a little bit more, Nicole, but yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Thank you for that question. But okay, seeing someone saying yes. All right. Familiar, but love to learn. Oh, beautiful. Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. All right. So I do want to get into the next slide here. Oh, okay, great. All right, next slide here. We want to compare, observation and participant observation. So there is what I like to call like it's observation and evaluation. For me and in my professional career, it's really kind of on a spectrum between being the complete observer and the complete participant, and the participant observation falling in the middle. So I want to walk us through this graphic because I think that it does give a really good overview of what, being a complete observer means, being a participant observer, and being a complete participant. So first and foremost, the complete observer is a person that observes without interacting and observes implementation, right? You are just completely in observation mode and you don't participate in whatever activity or whatever, is happening. You're not actually playing a role in that. You are kind of an invisible fly on the wall, just looking at what's going on, right? You're in that complete observer role. On the other end of the spectrum, you have complete participant, which is, I tend not to use it, right? But that means that, your role is concealed, you are really integrated in said activity, said community, and someone doesn't the folks who are in that community, your role as anything other than a member of that community is something that they may or may not fully be aware of. But in the middle here you have the participant as observer and partner collaborator. This is someone who, is somewhere in between where they are observing and, seeing what's going on in the situation that they want to observe. However, this is someone that is going to, get that unique understanding in a different way, right? They're going to participate in some sort of way in said activity or said social setting, right? They're going to get that insider's emic perspective. And for those of you, I think some of you might be in the MSME program at American University, others might not be. But when you say that emic perspective is really that insider's intimate perspective of what's going on in the social setting that you are observing. You get to see a little bit more about, and participate in some sort of way about local, political issues and what projects might work, how implementation is progressing, or having some insight into impact, right? So I just wanted to compare really quickly in this graphic and thank you for that in the chat. And really quickly in this graphic of like, if we were to compare observation and participant observation, what that looks like. But today's presentation, we're really going to break that down. So hopefully we'll get an even better perspective of these two, qualitative research measures. So first off, we're going to talk about participant observation. This next slide is just a title slide saying participant observation. So we can go to the next slide so I can start defining it. Thank you. So for participant observation, right? Participant observation is a research method where the researcher, like I said, immerses themselves in a particular social group or setting. They're observing the behaviors, the interactions, and the practices of the participants. Now, participant observation can be a valuable method for any research project that really seeks to understand the experiences of individuals or groups in a particular social context. All right, so in participant observation of the researcher, if you have that role as the researcher, that's called a participant observer, meaning that they participate in the group's activities while also observing the group's behavior and interactions. So there is some level of flexibility to the participation, ranging from non-participatory, like I said before, to complete participation, right? And the goal here is to really gain a deep understanding of the group's culture, beliefs, and practices from that insider or emic perspective. And yes, thank you so much for monitoring that chat. So yes, it does sound very anthropological, right? Absolutely. They do have some similar origins and theories. So I'm glad that the docs are connecting to that, right? And when I was in the MSME program, I was actually coming off the heels of my Peace Corps service, and I had the opportunity to sort of serve in this capacity as both an active participant in a lot of the activities and the traditions that were going on in the community. But also as an observer to really learn and understand the social settings that I was in. So that was a very, very concrete experience that I was able to get, and I was able to apply that to a lot of my projects when I was in the program. On this next slide, I want to talk about the participant observation uses, right? So as evaluators, we normally use participant observation when, we are studying subcultures or groups within unique practices or beliefs, right? So this participant observation in this context fosters a deep and intimate understanding of beliefs, values, and practices of your group or subculture of interest from that insider's perspective. And this can be especially useful when studying historically marginalized groups or groups that might be resistant to having someone just be in a space, right, and watch. That this could be a good way to meet them where they're at with that. The next way in which we can use participant observation is when you're studying complex social interactions, right? So participant observation can be a powerful tool for studying complex social interactions that occur within a particular group or community. So by immersing yourself in the group and observing these interactions firsthand, you can gain a much more nuanced understanding of how these interactions flow. And lastly, when you are studying behaviors or practices that may be difficult to self-report. So in some cases, participants may be unwilling or unable to accurately report their own behaviors or practices. So participant observation allows researchers to observe these behaviors directly, and that allows for better data collection in that data collection phase of your evaluation. So now that we've gone through the definition, we got through some uses for observations, I want to go through an example, all right? And this is something that, kind of just have here. So an example of participant observation is, say that you are studying the social dynamics of a small rural community located where you grew up. Right. So you want to gain an in-depth understanding of the community and its residents. You decide to conduct a participant observation. So say, for example, you rent a house in the community and you began participating in community events. For example, you're going to town meetings, you're going to social gatherings, you're going to church services, and you can also engage in everyday activities, such as shopping at the local market, going to anything in the schools, the plays, recitals, and just really being seen around town, right? So you do this over the course of several months, and you can also, observe and take notes of the social interactions, customs, and beliefs of the community members that you're, amongst. You can also, conduct some informal interviews with individual residents to gain a further insight into their experiences and perspectives. And through the observations, you can gain a much deeper understanding of the community's culture. This is inclusive of its values and traditions and maybe any sort of social hierarchies. And you then use the data you collected to develop, theories or insights about the community and its role in society. So this is just a really rough example of a participant observation, but as you can see from this example is that, you play the role of being in a participant, right, role, right? You go to activities, you participate in, community events, you could participate in the day-to-day, and you also allow yourself that space to observe, take notes, absorb, and learn about what's going on in the community to develop insights and theories, about that community as best as you can, right? Because from an outsider's perspective, you can only have so much of an understanding not coming from that community, but you develop some insights as to learning a little bit more about that community, with the understanding that you can never be fully competent or fully all-knowing about a community that you do not belong in. Now, this next slide here is, I want to talk a little bit about some advantages of participant observation, right? There are many of them. So in terms of the advantages, so participant observations really, allow you to generate rich and nuanced qualitative data. It's particularly useful when seeking to develop a deep understanding of a particular social context or experience. And this is done by really immersing yourself in the group. You can gain an unrivaled insider or that email perspective on the group's beliefs, values, and practices. Participant observation can be a really flexible research method that can be adapted to fit a variety of research questions and contexts, right? And I find that this is particularly useful because especially as you're studying maybe the social interactions and the cultures and the customs of a different, of a different community than your own, that flexibility and that adaptability allows you, to not only answer your research questions, but also to be really respectful and appropriate of the community that you are participating in. Also, for example, for this one, metrics like level of participation in the group, the length of the observation period, and the types of data collected all can be adjusted based on the research goals and timelines. Participant observation is often used as well in a combination with other research methods, such as, like I mentioned in that example, interviews or surveys. And this can help to provide a complete picture of the phenomena that's being studied, right? And this triangulation can really help improve the reliability and the validity of the research findings as participant observation isn't always as strong as a standalone method, but it becomes even stronger when it's coupled with some of these other research methods. Now, on this next slide, I want to talk about some of the disadvantages, if you will, for lack of a better word, about of participant observation. So, like many observational studies, participant observations are at a high risk for sometimes some research bias, particularly on the side of the researcher. And because the participant observation involves the researcher really immersing themselves in the groups being studied, there is a risk to sometimes insert your own biases that could influence the data that you collect, leading to an observer bias. So when you're doing research, I do think it's always important to understand some of the limitations and some of the biases that could come through so that you could be aware of that as you're conducting your research. So likewise, the presence of the researcher in the group being studied can potentially influence the behavior of the participants, right? So this can lead to inaccurate or biased data if participants alter their behavior in response to the researcher's presence. And I know that I had mentioned observer bias, so I do want to define that very clearly for us. So, observer bias happens when a researcher's expectations, opinions, or maybe their prejudices influence what they perceive or record in a study. Now, this next bullet here is saying that participant observations can be very expensive. They can be time consuming and sometimes they can be challenging to carry out, right? And this is only because they often require a long period of time to be able to build trust and gather sufficient data, with the data usually collected in an intensive in-person manner. So you are going to have to be willing to really dedicate that time to gain that trust and gain that rapport. And gaining that trust and rapport actually helps mitigate some of that biases, that observer biases, but also the participants may be altering their behavior when they trust you. They can, hopefully be their authentic selves. So we can maybe mitigate that by investing that time. But just knowing that in order to do a really effective participant observation, you have to be dedicated to, putting in the time and putting in the work that it will take to get some really good data. Now, lastly, participant observation can raise some ethical concerns, potentially requiring measured ethical consideration of the part of the researcher, right? This is really in regards to informed consent, privacy, confidentiality, right? So as you're conducting your research, you want to make sure that you have permission and the consent and folks really know what your what it is of your role as a participant observer, making sure that you're treating the community with the respect that they deserve, treating the customs, traditions, and the things that you hear with the privacy and the confidentiality that it deserves. And really, ultimately, the researcher must take care to protect the privacy and autonomy of the participants and ensure that they are not placed at undue risk by the research. But these are all at disadvantages, for lack of a better word, that can be mitigated. But I think in terms of us learning, we just want to point out what those could look like. All right. And on this next slide here, I want to summarize what I've discussed. So I did pull a video here that I think will be a good, summary of what I've said and maybe adding a little bit more information to what I said before we move on to just observation. So if you can play this for me.
We need to go back to Weber's principle of Verstehen, or understanding sociology. This is where you understand the subject in terms of their own environment. This can also be identified as ethnography, which is the descriptive study of humans within their certain groups or societies. So what is participant observation? This is a method of collecting data specifically for qualitative research to study humans in their natural habitats. In what case would a researcher use participant observation? This method is primarily used to understand setting, identify group norms and hierarchies, and form bonds which allow for deeper qualitative research. What is participant observation in practice? Well, in short, a researcher will select a site and gain access, and from then on, start to establish social relationships. All the while, they will be listening, watching, and taking notes. What role does the researcher play? There are four main options: complete observer, complete participant, observer as participant, or participant as observer. But whatever role you play, you will have to follow some ground rules. Most importantly, paying attention to ethics. Be clear about what you are doing, keep participants anonymous, and be careful with researcher-participant relationships. As you begin to access the community, be open and present in order to gain their trust. This will be completed in the first phase of getting in, called learning the rules. Next, you will go through the acquaintance phase, and finally, the intimate phase, where observation will be in full swing. So how do researchers observe? They can observe directly by noticing the preliminary items and details in the environment. There's also focused observation, which is conducted through interviews and conversations, and additionally, selective observation, where the researcher selects one main activity of the group to observe. And before I go, here are some tips for collecting data and taking field notes. First and foremost, pay attention to detail. Also, don't be too intrusive. Make sure to know all the important W and H questions. And lastly, try and shift your perspective for well-rounded observation.
Thank you. Okay. So I hope that video, I know it was a short 2.5 or so minute video, but I hope that it did give a good summary to what we already discussed, and it made it even more clear, and it raised some new points for you all. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about just observation on the slide after that video. There you go. And this is just this is the title slide. So in observation, we're going to talk a little bit more about a full observation. And I do have some information about note taking, and I have another video. So hopefully that will, summarize observation pretty well too. But in terms of observation generally refers to when an evaluator just observes project activities in action. Right? Observation allows the evaluator to really see what is happening with the project or see what is happening in that community or social setting. So observation has a pretty unique niche among evaluation methods, I would say. Those who study, for example, human behavior indicate that there's often a gap between what people say they do and what they actually do, right? So the observed behavior is often a more dependable indicator than what can be self-reported in some situations. Also, observation is used in a variety of ways in evaluation. It can often be the gateway method that leads to other methods. And this is similar to what we talked about with participant observation, is that it can also be coupled with other, research methods. So, for example, an evaluation might begin with the exploratory observation, where the evaluator is paying attention to a wide variety of factors, and then we move on to maybe some focus groups, interviews, surveys, what have you. So, this is observation is really an exploratory step that can also help narrow the study and refine the evaluation strategy. So, the next step from that could be a more focused observation using checklists, targeting specific behaviors, right? So, observation can be an iterative process. So, you can do the exploratory, like, let's find out what's all going on. And then after that, you can do a little bit more of a focused observation where you can make a checklist of looking at certain behaviors and seeing how often they come up. Or the exploratory observation might lead, like I said, to other evaluation methods. So I want to talk about on this next slide here a little bit more about what is observation in evaluation. So shortly, observation and evaluation is different actually than the casual manner in which we see things on the day-to-day. It must be done very carefully. So a careful observation is a distinctive in three important ways. I would say that the person or the researcher, whoever is doing the observation, is well trained. They are prepared to enter that space and prepared with, understanding the time, understanding the building of trust, understanding their purpose, and just understanding how to really enter that space in the best way. And it has to be systematic. So trainings help the evaluator know what to observe, when to conduct the observation, and how to document it. Once again, in terms of the preparation, the evaluator must be prepared mentally and physically for the rigors and the demands of observation. And the evaluator must systematically capture the observation data, often using multiple methods, right? This can be field notes where you're just taking notes on everything. It's not super structured, or you can have a checklist, which that checklist is sort of some of that targeted behavior or targeted things that you want to see that can be done after you do a larger exploratory observation, audio memos, etc. Right? So you want to be really systematic in the way that you capture a lot of the data. And I'm seeing some good questions here. So I want to acknowledge them, and we did say the whole questions until the end, but I do want to acknowledge that there are questions here, and I appreciate them coming in. All right, so I know for participant observation, I gave this very robust, I think it was robust, example of participant observation, but here I'm just going to give some examples of what observation could look like in evaluation, right, on the shorthand. So first, conducting an observational site visit at a school, office, facility, texting, visual posters, exhibits, and displays, seeing people's, reactions to them, how people engage with them, observing participants at a meeting, conference, or discussion. I've done that before. And observing how things get done, in terms of a customer service setting, right? So I know I gave an example of like, how are apologies made to an inconvenienced customer? How do, in a customer service setting, say you work at Target, right? How do workers engage with the consumers, and how do workers mitigate challenges with consumers? How do they help them? If a consumer or a customer is inconvenienced, how do they handle that? How is an apology made? You can observe how things get done like that as well. So observation is very diverse. So you can use it in a lot of different ways. And once again, on this next slide here, I want to really make clear like what to observe, what we can observe, right? And this participant observation book, this is one that I learned about from Bev when I was in the program from James Bradley. Really, like, what did we observe, right? And you already know this. I know I'm kind of repeating the same things, but I want to make sure that we have a confident understanding of what to observe. And so in terms of participant observation, it's, cultural behavior, knowledge and artifacts, maybe objects, art, activities, events, the space, feelings, what have you, right? And also, we can observe a physical setting, participants' interactions, routines, activities, conversations, nonverbal communication, and also physical space. All right, so I just wanted to reiterate when it comes down to observation, both observation and participant observation, what can we actually look at, right? Okay, and on this next slide, we're hearing a lot about note taking. And this is something that I learned when I was in the MSME program, something that Dr. Peters actually taught me. So if you all have any questions on note taking, I think that, there are people in the space who can give more insight to that as well. But from what I learned when I was in the program and what I've been able to practice is that as you engage in both observation and participant observation, you usually write notes that become your raw data, right? So I usually like to take a few notes when I'm engaging in participant observation. You can take down direct quotations if you think they might be useful. And when you leave that situation, when you leave that setting, you can immediately summarize or outline your observations, right? And you can do that by, drawing a diagram of the setting so you can remember what that looks like, and the movements of the community to help give depth to your observations. And this usually includes verbal descriptions of the settings, the people, and the activities, right? So there's a lot of different ways you can take notes. I have actually exercised a lot of these. I have just taken notes of okay, what did I see? What did I observe? What stood out to me? And I think drawing diagrams and maps is really helpful, right? When I was in my community, I did like to draw out the space to really help visualize what it looked like, and how people really engaged with that space. I also drew a map of the community so I could know where things were, where the churches were, where the market was. And that really helped for me to really learn about that community, and visualize it even more. And that also supported some of the notes that I was taking to add additional context. And I want to go to this next slide here. Thank you. In terms of the limits of observations, once again, I do think that participant observation and observation are really good research methods, but we do always have to consider some of the limitations, right? Because research always does have its limitations. So first, we have to think about maybe some fatigue, right? So because observation is tedious and can be really tiring. So what you seek to observe may also not occur on a regular basis. So being attentive takes energy, and the observer needs to develop strategies for remaining alert for potentially lengthy periods of time. There also might be a component of emotional stress, right? So sometimes the observation itself causes stress, and other times the person doing the observation is stressed about other things. Stress tends to erode our ability to observe. So just, be aware that that could play a factor. Disruptions and distractions. So like I said, observations takes time. And disruptions to your observation and maybe some distractions can be expected, and they should be expected, right? And once again, time. And you're going to hear me say this a lot, but time. What is the length of the observation? You have to think about that, right? Because the length of the observation is specified in your evaluation plan, hopefully, and is based on a thoughtful assessment of what is being observed. The expected occurrence of meaningful events and the available resources, right? Some things can be observed in a short amount of time, and in other studies, your objective may be to get longer time profile of the topic. But in general, it is better to have a longer period of observation because it increases the odds of observing activities or events that occur less frequently. Now, I want to walk you through, I have a lot here, but I want to walk you through some considerations and observations, right? And I have about 11 considerations here. So there are a lot, I know. But I'm going to unpack each and every single one of them and hopefully they can be really clear, because when we decide on our research methods and when we decide to do one, we have to think about it all. We have to think about the limitations, we have to think about the ethics, we have to think about the pros and the cons. So I really do want to leave you with some really good things to consider when we are doing observations. So first and foremost, we have do a quick scan of research and other evaluations, right? So if you have had another evaluator or researcher in the space that you're observing, try to figure out what others have found. How has it been documented or measured? But also keep an open mind and be ready for unexpected occurrences. Now, it's develop a framework, a theory, or an idea of what you are observing, right? So you want to put it into writing, share it with some others, and ask for feedback to make sure that it's, really, really good and you feel confident in it. Number three, like I said before, I would recommend you do an exploratory evaluation, and observation. And that's really to go to the location, get acquainted with the environment, the situation, the people, and just figure out what's going on, right? Watch, ask questions, listen, and take notes. This exploratory investigation gives insight as to the efficacy and the practicality of a more intensive observation study, right? So that's what I was talking about a couple of slides ago, is that you might want to start with an exploratory evaluation where you're just figuring out what is going on in the space. And that could give insights into what you want to observe next in a little bit more of a focused way. Or maybe you might need to redirect in some sort of way, and figure out if there's another data collection method that you can use if you find out that maybe it's not the best one for you. The next one is to develop your observational strategy, right? You want to create a plan, you want to be organized, you want to be prepared, put it in writing, and invite feedback from colleagues. Next, you want to practice observing with others on the evaluation team, if you have an evaluation team. You want to practice observing with others on the evaluation team to be sure that the same things are being observed and recorded in a consistent manner. That's really that interreliability that you want between your evaluation team if you are not working on your own. As you observe, think about what is not happening, what is missing that logically should be present. Consider developing and using an observation checklist, right? So checklists help the observer remember what to watch for. They may be a quantifiable skill to document observations, and it creates a verifiable record. A checklist can help focus the evaluation, keeps the observation consistent, and allows for comparison. A checklist can include, for example, time and duration of said activity, if you're observing an activity, right? Frequency, how often did it occur? The extensiveness of it, is it widespread, is it isolated? The intensity, the demographics or observable characteristics of the participants. It can include environmental factors, behaviors, comparison with the standard guideline or ideal or to other cases. And there's just a lot of things that your checklist can include. This is not, a prescriptive list, but this is something that you can consider when making a checklist. But I want to reiterate that if you do want to make a checklist of what to potentially observe and then check off, what actually you saw in the space for that more targeted observation, I would recommend that you do an exploratory observation first in order to make that checklist and figure out what to actually really look for. Use visuals. So like I said before, take detailed field notes, make sketches, create diagrams, maps, time logs, etc. This might not be for you, but this is something that I tell myself. I don't always trust my memory. I'm not just like, I'm going to remember that later. I don't have to jot that down, because I do. And I have to take very, very, very detailed notes. I have to draw the sketches. I have to make the maps. I have to do all those things to really thoroughly document what I observed. because if I don't, it's out. It's not coming back. So, and these documents are really essential, honestly, to later analysis. So you want to make sure you document thoroughly. Be careful of selective perception, right? So selective perception is when you notice things are familiar or expected and overlook those things that are uncomfortable, unusual, or don't make sense. You seeing those things you expect to see or what you're accustomed to seeing, is, what's to be expected, right? And when that happens, we can easily get confused when observing things that are different or novel. So we are human, right? So we understand that this could potentially happen, but we just want to be careful of it and we want to be aware of it, right? There are some patterns that you will see in observation. There are some repeated behaviors, repeated themes that will come up, but make sure that you're always open to the new, the unfamiliar, or the unknown. Consider comparison, right? The ability to compare one observation to another can often be critical to analysis. So an isolated observation can be useful, right? Because you can work independently, and as an observer, I've done that, and it isn't to say that is a bad thing, but I do think that there can be strength in numbers on this. Because if you are observing the same community or the same activity, you might want to, have another evaluator there or another researcher there because you might want to compare what you're seeing over time. And often what is important is the nature of the trend or how it compares to an observation in other locations or with other people. And I think that adds to the validity of what you are seeing, especially if two folks are seeing very similar patterns and themes. And lastly, if you can, I do believe that there's strength in numbers to work with a team. I did a lot of my observation on my own, but I do see that there is a strength in working with a team. So colleagues improve the process of collecting and analyzing data. And you can, debrief with colleagues at the conclusion of the observation to really just get a general consensus or just understanding of what was observed and understood. So these are some of the considerations and observations. I hope they are helpful that you might want to have in your brain as you're thinking about this and as you're developing this for yourself. Now I wanted to go to this next slide. And this is, I think it's about a 3-minute video of observations and qualitative research that I think it might be a little bit repetitive to what I've already said, but I just want to make sure that we really understand, the concepts and the topics that we've learned today. So please enjoy.
This short video is going to give an overview of using observation methods in qualitative research. Some reasons to use direct observations are as an alternative to informant self-report, such as questionnaires, when you have a need for contextual information about the setting or about other events that are happening, or when you're using a mixed methods approach. There are 2 key types of direct observation. The first is structured, using checklists or rubrics with a form that you've developed or that you've adapted. And then there's unstructured, where you're taking field notes simply on everything you see. And then there's a combination of both types, and lots of variations out there. As an observer, you will be doing some interpretation about what you're seeing. And there's 3 types of behavior interpretation. There's the direct, inferential, and evaluative. The following slides will give you some steps to how to get started with doing an observation. The first thing you'll want to do is create a template to collect your information. One of the things that you might want on your template is a rubric. Rubrics are typically one of the more structured things that you'll want to use in an observation, and it will help you record specific behaviors that you see. There's 2 types of rubrics. There's a basic rubric without ratings and a more complex rubric that has ratings on it. Rubrics that require more from the observer than simply just the presence or absence of a behavior typically will have levels or scales, and each point on the scale is called an anchor. You can have numerical ratings, but that's not necessarily required. It depends on your study. Depending on your method and your approach and what kind of study you're working on, you'll either have a space on your observation form for open-ended notes, or actually your entire observation might just consist of open-ended field notes. It's very important to train your observers so that if you have more than one observer and they're using a template or a rubric, that they're using it consistently, and that if they're observing the same event, that they're getting close to the same results. This is a little bit different if you're just using open-ended field notes. It's really important to pilot your observation form before you launch it. Once you get out into the field, you'll realize immediately that there are a lot of contextual factors that might impact the final design. A much bigger topic in methodology, and something I'm just going to briefly touch on here, is observer effects. Of course, your presence as an observer could impact both those that you're observing, research or not research related, and it can impact your results. I hope that you spend quite a bit of time learning about observer effects and how those might impact your particular study and the population that you're interested in. Overall, thank you so much for watching.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So for those of you who might have been to a webinar of mine in the past, I always like to use videos, YouTube videos to really complement and add to what I've said. So I hope you all heard the audio well enough, and I hope that it helped. But that is actually the end of my content for the day. But we do have a lot of time actually for Q&A. Right. And I know that there's some things in the chat. Douglas, are you gonna help me monitor this? How are we doing
yeah,
this?
no, well, let's just start from the bottom if that's okay, Tiffany. That's terrific. Do you recommend having the observer being the note taker or having a separate note taker?
Yeah, that is a great question. I also would love if Dr. Peters can chime in on this, because for me, in my experience with observation, I actually prefer to be the note taker myself or others of the evaluation team. If I'm on a team, which I said I'm not on a team, but if I were on a team, I would prefer to be the note taker myself. And I think that's really because, you are the one who is building that rapport with their community. You are the one who has ideally, develops the research questions and the purpose of the research, the purpose of the evaluation. You have that intimate understanding of what that research project is. And you're the one who's doing a lot of, the work in terms of building that rapport and gaining that trust and participating in those activities. And I find that to support that EMIC perspective of getting that insider's perspective, you really do need to immerse yourself in that. And I feel like for me personally, I like to take the notes because I'm the one who's actually participating in said behavior, and I'm, observing, the environment around me. And I have that different perspective than someone who's just, might be observing me participating. But that's just for me personally. I prefer to be the note taker, and I recommend that the observer or the evaluator be the note taker. But Dr. Peters might have a different view or more nuanced view of that I think will be helpful to answer this question.
For me, I also like to be the note taker. But oftentimes when we engage in participant observation, we're not the only ones there taking notes. So that you would have a team taking notes, and then you would compare all of those different notes. When I engage in participant observation in particular, a lot of my notes are informal interviews that I am conducting, talking to people. So maybe it's a key informant interview or just an open-ended interview. Tell me how this works. And so one of the things I found in my notes is that I have to be very specific. I'm doing an observation and Tiffany said this, not just have somebody told me this, but be very specific in those notes that Tiffany said this, Yasemin said this, Doug said that. And if I want to follow up later, then I know who to follow up on. The type of data that I get from participant observation is it's not going to be survey data. It's not going to be specific numerical data. It is really more of that qualitative feel for how things are working, how things are going, and it helps me to inform my further research as well.
Wonderful. Thank you for that support. And I heard, Yasmin, you had a question about kind of reporting the observations data.
Yes, exactly. Would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, yeah. So for me, the observation is a very valid, normal, like qualitative research method, right? So when, say, for example, we are doing a report, in terms of sharing those findings, like we didn't get too much into analysis today because that's a whole other different topic that we can talk about how to analyze this data. But when you have your field notes and when you have all the data that you've collected, what you tend to do, I think I mentioned this a little bit, is you do tend to look for themes, that come up, and frequent themes that come up to really build those insights. So when you report your findings from the observation, I would say that it's really thematic. That when you have your report, you're like, these are the themes that came up based on observations, like analyzing and coding observation data, analyzing and coding data from some of those focus groups you might be doing or those interviews you might be doing. So I think the best way to share them in a report is by highlighting the themes that you found after you analyze the data. Now, something that I do want to say when it comes down to sharing, findings in general from your research, I am in a place in my career when I'm kind of like, are you going to read this report? Right. And, 'cause I'm like, who has the time? So, what I've actually done, and this isn't just something that's unique to participant observation, but just in general, as a young evaluator myself, what I'm starting to do is during the initial phase with the community, with the partner, whoever I'm working with, I like to ask them when it comes down to my findings, I can always write a report. But what would you like that report to look like? Would you like it to be more visual? Would you like it to be graphic designed? Would you like it to be in a different way that can really be digestible for folks to be able to suss out those findings? Or would you like a presentation? Would you like for me to make a PowerPoint presentation and walk you through all this? And that will be a better way to observe the data, or a combination of both, right? So I just want to say that in general, when it comes down to just reporting findings from whatever data you collect, I recommend that you all really work with whoever is going to be on the receiving end, the intended users of said research. Like, what is the best way in which they would like to receive those findings, right? But in terms of, summarizing all of them, doing a coding and a thematic analysis to highlight those themes is the best way to really say, this is what happened. Hope that helped.
Yeah, I think you also answered Eduardo Benitez's question as well. Eduardo, can you confirm that?
Oh, yes, maybe. Yeah, Eduardo, did that help? And you can put it in the chat. Oh, wonderful. Yay. Thank you. All right. And I want to pronounce your, is it Miche? I want to say your name properly. I know that you had asked for my LinkedIn, and this is for everybody. I didn't include my LinkedIn link in the slides, but I did put it in the chat for you all. So happy to connect.
And also, Tiffany, is it possible to ask another question from the chat?
Yes.
When one is conducting observations, that perhaps that might affect the people in the room, the people you're interacting with. How do you sort of get around that, sort of like perhaps introduction of bias or some sort of change in behavior? Do you simply note what's going on, or how do you sort of like, account or take care of that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think Tila asked that in the chat. So thank you so much for that. So yeah, I mean, bias in research is always a challenging one because it does come up. We're all human, right? And we're all kind of born with our way of looking at the world in our own lenses. But when it comes down to what I mentioned, right? I think I did mention this in the presentation about, how your observation could alter people's behaviors. I think A couple of things. So Tila mentioned that, I hope I'm saying your name right, Tila, that the informed consent is extremely important because it is. Absolutely. Getting that informed consent to be in that space so people know why you're there, the purpose that you serve is really important. But when it comes down to the impact that it might have on people's behaviors, the best way that I personally have been able to address that and mitigate that myself, two ways. Number one, oh, there you are. Hi. Number one, what I have done is if as I'm, reporting the findings, whether it be in a report or whether it be, in a presentation, I just tell the people that I'm presenting, like, listen, there is the possibility that this did happen, right? Just acknowledging it in general. But in order to try to mitigate it from happening as much as possible, what has really worked for me is that relationship building, that trust building, and that rapport building in the very beginning. That's why it takes so much time, right? Because in order for people to really feel like they can actually present themselves in the truest form, they have to really be able to trust you. And they have to really be able to know, that you are someone that is safe for them to be their authentic selves with. So that's why I think that relationship building and that trust building is really important because that does help play a role in that biases that might impact their behavior a little bit. That trust really helps, at least in my experience. That's really helped. I hope that helps, Tila.
Thank you very much. I know we're coming to the end of our time reasonably soon, but I want to get in another question from Eduardo, asking about the idea of categorization as a method when doing observations. Do you think that this is a great idea of doing it, or any other thoughts on how else to approach observations?
Yeah. Thank you for bringing it up to the surface. I know that we when earlier when I spoke about when you have that data, doing that coding or that finding the themes, the thematic analysis of that data is really the best way to really categorize and summarize what you've been able to absorb and what you've been able to learn about that community. That's really for me the best way to really synthesize that data and to really present it in a concise way is to find those themes and to present them in your final report. And then I know that I think it might have been someone from AU who said that direct quotations are a good way to showcase data, and I'm going to uplift that and agree with that as well. Is that in addition to those themes that you were able to extrapolate from that data, having direct quotations to support said themes or to support said findings is really important. And as it's saying in the chat here, you can use a text box quote in your evaluation reports, because I feel like that's in addition is getting those codes, Eduardo, as we mentioned before, but also some of those direct quotations that we did recommend that maybe you write down, and making sure that they're anonymous and not attributing them to a specific person, but having direct quotations in your report also makes that pop a little bit more.
Well, thank you very much, Tiffany. I think we're coming to the end here. And let me just say, unless we have another question in the chat, we might have time for one more, but I think we're about done with that as well. That's been terrific, and we can't really appreciate enough the fact that you've been able to describe, the approaches of how to do observation, the context of what's to think about, and then also like actually how to do it, and all sorts of excellent tips and thoughts on how to get it done. So when we also want to consider that coming up, we have another webinar on November 12th with Mastering Data Narratives with Dan Meyer. That'll be terrific. But this has been a terrific presentation, Tiffany. I can't thank you enough. And let me just hand it over to Yasmin for a final thought.
Yes, thank you so much, Tiffany. I'll be putting that registration for Mastering Data webinar coming up in the chat shortly. Tiffany, thank you so much again for joining us and giving us so many good tips and tricks, as you always do. If you have any questions for Tiffany, she gave us our link or her LinkedIn address. Feel free to connect or reach out to her that way. Thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon
Thank
or
you for
evening
having
or
me.
day.
Add me on LinkedIn. I love talking evaluation and data, so please keep in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.